So I think that these pieces that we're cutting out of a very long interview are just the salient points that Dr. Howe, my friend Richard, was making during our interview. And I trust you'll enjoy this. It really spells things out about the need for philosophy to help your theology. One of the things that I wanted you to help us with, Richard, is just the role of philosophy. I mean, I understand worldview because I understand philosophy. And I
Hmm.
understand how philosophy really just produces a worldview. And I don't want to take things away from you, but I know you've taught some things and even did some sessions for us at one of my conferences on
Hmm.
how philosophy, um, I guess, helps our theology is the best way to say it. It
Hmm.
and so if you would talk to that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So, isn't it a gift that you and I can be able to say that we studied under someone like a Norman Geisler? He was such
Yeah.
a tremendous mentor in my life. I met him as I was a student at Dallas Seminary back in the early 80s.
Hmm.
And back then, not only were there very few seminaries that had more than maybe a couple of courses in apologetics, which had already become my increasing interest and passion as a young Christian. But by the early 80s, I think some seminaries were actually dropping their apologetics courses. I think probably because they didn't know how to respond to postmodernism. So they're like, well, nobody's asking these factual questions anymore. We need to move on.
Right.
And I got a little kind of discouraged while I was a student because the itch wasn't being scratched. I didn't know what that meant, what it
Mm-hmm.
was about being, because I mean, Dallas Seminary to me was the zenith of seminaries, and it was just a dream come true to be a student.
Right.
So I had eventually just quit taking classes, and I was living and working full time in Dallas, Texas, and I was counseling with Dr. Geisler about the direction of my life, and I was considering maybe I need to just table my studies and go with an apologetics ministry. I think Probe Ministries was a big thing, and it still
Right.
is, but it was a big thing there, and it was local. And he gave me some advice, Ray, that really was some of the most important guidance I had ever achieved in my practical Christian life. And he said, well, and he would probably give different advice today, as I'll explain in a second. But he said, what I think you should do is go back to the university and do philosophy. Because what he
Hmm.
realized then, and I only came to realize later, was that though not everything in theology and apologetics is philosophy, obviously, a lot of
Right.
it is. And he
Yeah.
knew, I think today he would be able to say, hey, what you need to do is go to SES, Southern Evangelical Seminary, where I taught, where you studied, because there you were integrating philosophy and apologetics with the theology all together. But
Right.
he couldn't give that kind of advice. There wasn't a such thing as an SES or a Biola or a Houston Baptist or a Liberty or any of these other kinds of schools that are now increasingly noted for their apologetics. So I did begin to learn then how critical philosophy was. In fact, I appreciate the way you worded the topic.
Hmm.
When I do the presentations on philosophy vis-a-vis theology in the Christian life, I have two different titles depending on how suspicious I think my audience might be about the subject of
Yeah.
philosophy. Because I know if the people are reticent to almost hostile, then I will tend to want to label it how philosophy can help your theology. But what I really do mean, and in other contexts, I call the presentation how theology needs
Philosophy.
philosophy, which is
Very
pretty
good. Great.
pretty boastful or ambitious, and certainly self-serving since I am a philosopher by
Yeah.
training. But I think it's really true. And I start out when I try to get people to understand the role that it plays, I try to draw a parallel that I think is relatively uncontroversial from the natural sciences in order to show how the natural sciences in church history have sometimes been instruments in correcting our misunderstanding of scripture.
Right.
And I think I heard Geisler say that sometimes our our thinking, whether it's our science or our philosophy, whatever, sometimes that can correct a misunderstanding of Scripture. And then sometimes Scripture can correct a misunderstanding of our understanding of the world.
Right.
So, and the example I use is out of the 16th, 17th century, all of the row that surrounded the solar system, and whether the sun was the center of the solar system as
Right.
Copernicus and Galileo were beginning to champion, or whether the Earth was. And there was a very interesting argument that Cardinal Bellarmine gave against Galileo to prove biblically that the Earth was not moving and that the sun was moving relative to the Earth. And it was a passage out of Joshua,
Hmm.
Joshua chapter 10, where Joshua commanded the sun to stand still.
Stand still.
And Bellarmine's argument was, well, look, you can't command something to stand still if it's not moving. So obviously, biblically, it's moving. Therefore, this Copernican model is false. Well, we now know that the astronomers have demonstrated that, well, indeed, relative to the sun, it's the Earth that's moving because it's
Mm-hmm.
orbiting the
Yeah.
sun. Okay, so then the question is, well, what do we do with this Joshua 10 passage? Well, we make a hermeneutical move that we were already making with other verses, where we take it as phenomenological or language of appearance,
Right.
phenomenological language or language of appearance. We say it has the appearance of moving. And it wasn't like we were just making up some hermeneutical principle to shoehorn the Bible in with the latest conclusions of science. No,
Yeah.
because we were already using that principle of
Mm-hmm.
language of appearance out of Joel 2, when Joel says the moon would turn to blood. And surely nobody, including Robert Bellarmine, didn't believe that the moon was going to become liquid with
Right.
corpuscles and plasma. Well, why does it say the moon turned to blood? Because it turned red like blood. It had the appearance. And so by parallel, then I go, if it's possible and actual that astronomy can correct on occasion and govern and set boundaries to what we think are proper interpretations of Scripture, if that's the case, then might other disciplines do the same thing, including philosophy? Is it possible, at least in principle, that we could know certain things about the nature of reality by reason that sets boundaries as to what is a plausible interpretation, for example, of a given verse of Scripture?
So there you could see, I really don't want to give away too much all in one thing, but Richard has so much to give and help us think about how philosophy helps our theology, but he also just strengthens our apologetics as well. And it was just a great time to spend with Richard. I wish we had more time to do that sort of thing, or did it more often, I should say. And this may turn out to be the best of Dr. Howe, but we got plenty more to come as well. I hope you enjoyed this piece.